Okay, asking you shall receive. Let's talk about the tragic case of Nicholas Barclay and the man who wasn't. This all starts on June 13th, 1994. Nicholas Barclay lived in San Antonio, Texas, and the last people to see him alive were some of his friends. They were all playing basketball. He called his house and asked for his parents to pick him up, but his mom was asleep and his brother was like, I'm not going to wake her up. So Nicholas began the walk home alone. When Nicholas didn't come home that night, it wasn't all that strange because he was a little bit of a rebellious kid and he'd gotten in a lot of trouble before, and it wasn't all that crazy for him to sometimes go off and do his own thing. But when everyone woke up in the morning and saw that he had never come home through the night, that's when the worry started to set in. After about a day, they took it to the police and they were like, we think something happened to him this time. And the thing is, they had reported him missing to the police before. In fact, Nicholas had run away several times. He had committed a bunch of different petty crimes that he was actually about to go to trial for. And so the police wondered if he had skipped town because he was trying to avoid his consequences. But his mom didn't believe that, and she really pushed for them to open up a missing persons investigation. The police really didn't have much to go on, and days turned into months very quickly, and nobody had any idea what happened to this child. On September 25th, Nicholas's older half-brother actually called the police and said that he thought he saw Nicholas trying to break into his uncle's garage. By the time the police arrived, of course he was gone, and the police began to believe that maybe the older brother hadn't actually seen him. The case went cold, and the family started to lose hope. And then amazingly, in October of 1997, they get a phone call from Linares, Spain, saying that they found Nicholas. He had been discovered near a train station and they had relocated him to a youth shelter. The boy that they found refused to speak, but they were sure that it was him because officials there had seen pictures of Nicholas from Texas. The person on the phone believed that whoever the boy was who had to have been traumatized deeply and might have been abused for several years, but they were like, come on over, see if it's your family member. Nicholas's sister actually flew to Spain, identified him as her brother, and brought him back to Texas. Of course, Nicholas's mother was overjoyed, but other people in the family were like, this doesn't seem right. The boy in question that they brought back had dark brown hair and dark brown eyes and spoke with a French accent and certain European phrasing. He said that he had been abducted, forced onto a plane, and forced into trafficking, and that his abductors had chemically changed his hair and eyes. Interestingly, one of the new Nicholas's changes that was most alarming to his family was his demeanor. See, 13-year-old Nicholas was a wild child. In fact, he regularly got into physical fights with his mother, and he would hit her and kick her. That's why the older brother had actually moved home. New Nicholas was calm, quiet, kind even. And frankly, the family was like, that doesn't make any sense. 13-year-old Nicholas had some tattoos that he had done pretty much himself, kind of stick and poke tattoos, and new Nicholas had the same tattoos. And so that kind of solidified it for certain people in the family. But there was a private investigator who had actually been helping the family try and find Nicholas, who really wasn't sold. His name was Charlie Parker. Charlie was just like, this all seems very inconsistent. None of it makes sense. And in fact, Charlie talked to the police and was like, we need to do a blood sample and a fingerprint analysis. The police were like, we can't force it. But Charlie showed them pictures of Nicholas when he was a child and Nicholas now. The ears didn't match. And also there's the whole situation that you can't chemically change people's eye color. And after a certain amount of time, brown hair that had been dyed would start growing out blonde. Charlie passed this information all the way up to the FBI, and the FBI actually got the court order forcing Nicholas Barclay to do fingerprints and a blood test. And of course, this was not Nicholas Barclay. This was 23-year-old French citizen Frédéric Pierre Bourdin. And he was known by another name at Interpol, the Chameleon, a young man who had assumed over 500 identities and had actually gotten involved with 4 other missing children's cases over the years. France immediately was like, is this some kind of deviancy thing. But ultimately, they determined that the reason why he picked families and tried to pretend to be the family's missing kids is that it gave him a place to live, a new identity, and essentially a place to hide out for a little while when things got too hot in Europe. They actually ended up picking him up at school and calling him out and immediately arresting him. And when they took off his hat, they realized that he was starting to go bald, which didn't make sense for a 16-year-old. His very extensive criminal history in Europe had Interpol take him back over. He pled guilty to passport fraud and perjury in 1998. He informed the American police that he had gotten the information about Nicholas and given himself the fake tattoos after getting the boy's information from a missing child center. Imagine that. Going through the American Missing Child's database so you can find one to pretend to be so you can steal from their family. After being exposed for being a con man and a fraud, Bourdin made some interesting accusations. First, he said that he actually met Nicholas while he was in Spain and said that Nicholas was alive. Then he said that he had proof that Nicholas was deceased. And later he said he never met him, but he learned everything about him from the news. And then he made another statement that he believed that the Barclay family was responsible for Nicholas's death. And the police were like, we think that one might be the right one. One of the things that the police found out was that in 1994, Nicholas's mother was addicted to heroin, and she went into recovery after her son vanished. She passed one polygraph about Nicholas's case, but she also failed another one. Nicholas's older brother was also considered to be a possible suspect, but he later died from a cocaine overdose in 1998. Bourdin went back to France and spent 6 years in prison, which is actually 6 times longer than you would normally spend for passport fraud. Now you know. To this day, Bourdin says that the Barclay family murdered their son and that they were happy to have him show up because that allowed them to pretend like they hadn't committed murder. P.I. Charlie Parker actually believed that Bourdin was onto something there. He's still considered to be a missing person, and they do have a age progression photo of what they think he might actually look like now. And it's nothing like what Bourdin looks like. But the likelihood that Nicholas is alive is very slim, and at this rate, we would be looking probably for remains somewhere around San Antonio, Texas. What do you think?